On the crisp autumn morning of November 9, 2005, the small town of Robinson, Texas, awoke to a day that would forever be etched into its collective memory. Nestled just south of the larger city of Waco, Robinson was the epitome of a close-knit community, a place where families had deep roots, neighbors knew each other by name, and the rhythms of life were predictable and comforting. It was a town built on shared values of faith, family, and hard work. But on this particular Wednesday, the tranquil veneer of this peaceful town was about to be violently torn away, shattered by a single, desperate phone call that sliced through the morning calm. A woman, her voice a fragile mix of panic and a strange, chilling composure, dialed 911. She reported that something unspeakable, something horrific, had taken place within the four walls of her suburban home. The details she offered were a confusing jumble, but the raw urgency in her tone communicated everything the dispatcher needed to know. Something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. That singular call to emergency services would pry open the door to a profoundly tragic tale, a domestic horror story that would leave the tight community reeling, a devoted family utterly devastated, and a stunned public struggling to comprehend the darkness that had emerged from behind a picture-perfect facade. This is the intricate and heartbreaking story of Darlene and Keith Gentry, a marriage that appeared to be filled with love, promise, and the joy of a growing family, but was secretly poisoned by resentment, financial strain, and a betrayal that would culminate in an act of profound and calculated tragedy. Darlene Doskasil was born on November 2, 1974, the middle child of three daughters raised in a devout and loving family. From her earliest days, there was a certain incandescence about Darlene. Relatives, friends, and later, an entire community remembered her as a girl who was radiant, remarkably disciplined, and brimming with an infectious zest for life. She was a young woman who was not only strikingly beautiful on the outside, but possessed a warm-hearted and deeply ambitious spirit. Growing up in the heart of Central Texas, Darlene blossomed into a local favorite, renowned for a dazzling smile that could light up a room, her signature blonde hair, and a natural, seemingly effortless ability to connect with others. While she never wore an official crown or sash, her innate grace and popularity earned her the affectionate nickname Texas Beauty Queen from classmates and teachers alike. Her high school years were a highlight reel of social success. She was voted prom queen, she was a proud member of the Flag Corps, and she always seemed to be at the vibrant center of every school event. Her charm wasn't a performance. It was an authentic part of her being. She stood out not merely because of her looks, but because of a genuine nature that made people feel seen and valued. Admired universally by her peers and deeply loved by her family, Darlene was a young woman with what appeared to be a clear, bright, and promising path laid out before her. Upon graduating from Yo High School in Cameron in 1993, she took the next logical step, enrolling at Texas State Technical College (TSTC) in Waco. Initially feeling a pull towards the dental field, she pursued and completed training to become a dental assistant. However, this was merely a stepping stone. Her long-term goal, a dream she nurtured quietly but fiercely, was to become a nurse, a profession that suited her desire to care for others. It was during these formative college years that she met someone who would completely and permanently alter the trajectory of her life, Keith Gentry. Keith, born on September 2, 1974 in Waco, was the cherished son of Wyman and Glenda Gentry. He spent his childhood in Robinson, the very town where he would later try to build his own family, a place where community and family still held profound, unshakable meaning. Keith, who had two sisters, was surrounded by a wide and loving circle of extended family who adored him. At Robinson High School, he was known for his easygoing personality and a quiet, unassuming strength. He wasn't flashy, loud, or outspoken, but those who truly knew him appreciated his profound reliability and his genuinely kind-hearted nature. Keith didn't crave the spotlight. He was content to simply do what needed to be done, whether at home, at school, or for a friend, without complaint or need for recognition. Like Darlene, he also enrolled at TSTC, where he focused his studies on the practical fields of drafting and welding. After college, he secured a stable and respectable job as an engineering assistant at a local utility company, methodically setting himself up for a solid and responsible future. Keith possessed the soul of a provider. He was focused, hardworking, and was already thinking about the kind of secure and loving life he wanted to build, even before he had a partner to build it with. Friends and family would often remark that he was a family man long before he officially settled down. When Keith and Darlene's paths finally crossed, the connection was immediate and electric. Their chemistry was undeniable, a magnetic pull that was obvious to everyone around them. It didn't take long for their initial attraction to deepen into a profound and serious love. Their families, seeing the genuine happiness they brought each other, quickly embraced their partner. Darlene's family was fond of Keith's steady nature, and Keith's family welcomed the vibrant Darlene with open arms. To their entire social circle, a wedding seemed not a matter of if, but when. But as is often the case with young love, their individual timelines for the future didn't perfectly align. By 1997, both had graduated from TSTC and were poised to take the next big steps in their adult lives. Darlene, by then, was quietly longing for a marriage proposal, ready to solidify their union. Keith, on the other hand, ever the more cautious and methodical of the two, felt he wasn't quite ready to commit to marriage or even the step of living together. After a series of difficult and honest conversations, they made the painful decision to part ways. Their families were blindsided by the news. Neither Darlene nor Keith handled the separation with ease. Both were left deeply hurt, grappling with the sudden uncertainty of a future that no longer included the other. Seeking a new beginning and a change of scenery, Darlene made the bold move to Dallas. There, she returned to the familiar world of dental work and attempted to adjust to the fast-paced, anonymous lifestyle of the big city. But the urban energy didn't suit her small-town soul. A jarring incident involving a stolen car, coupled with the pervasive sense of disconnection inherent in urban living, eventually took their toll. After about a year away, Darlene returned home to Central Texas, and it seemed as though fate was waiting patiently for her. It wasn't long before she and Keith crossed paths again. This time, there was no hesitation, no doubt. Their reunion was as swift as it was decisive. In 1999, Keith proposed, and not long after, they were married. It felt, to them and to everyone who loved them, like everything had finally, wonderfully fallen into place. The young couple purchased their first home and began earnestly building the life they had once only dreamed about. For Darlene, however, despite the joy of her marriage, something still felt incomplete. Though she had capably returned to her dental career, she realized with growing clarity that her true calling lay elsewhere. Motivated and more determined than ever, she made the decision to go back to school, this time to pursue her long-held dream of a nursing degree. Keith, the supportive husband, championed her ambitions completely, filled with pride as he watched his wife work diligently toward her goals. They were, by all accounts and every outward appearance, a blissfully happy couple. They laughed often, they shared responsibilities, and they fully embraced their roles as partners in life. By the early 2000s, Keith and Darlene Gentry had settled into what appeared to be an ideal life in the quiet community of Robinson. Their home stood in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, and in a twist of fate that spoke to their family-oriented nature, it was located right next door to Keith's parents. That physical closeness would prove to be both a source of comfort and, eventually, a deeply complex element in their story. Keith held a steady job as an engineering assistant at the local electric utility company, while Darlene achieved her goal and was now working as a registered nurse. With two stable incomes, they enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle, not extravagant, but more than sufficient to raise a family and enjoy occasional luxuries. Family was the absolute heart of their dreams. In 2001, their world was brightened by the birth of their first son, Chase. Cody followed in 2004, and by 2005, they welcomed a third son, Cade. The Gentry seemed to transition into the demanding world of parenthood with remarkable ease. Supported by both sets of loving grandparents, they built a life firmly rooted in love, stability, and cherished family traditions. They were the kind of family others in the community looked up to, an attractive, devoted couple with 3 beautiful, healthy boys and a well-kept, welcoming home. But beneath this pristine surface, the reality was far more complicated and fraught with hidden tensions. Keith's job, while stable, often required him to travel, leaving Darlene to juggle her demanding responsibilities at the hospital and at home on her own. She expertly managed the children, maintained the household, and kept up with her duties as a nurse. However, even when Keith returned from his trips, the balance of responsibilities didn't shift much. He was often physically and emotionally drained from his travels and sought rest rather than immediately jumping back into the joyful chaos of parenting 3 young boys. Recognizing the significant strain his travel schedule was placing on his marriage and his home life, Keith eventually made a monumental decision. He chose to leave his better-paying, travel-heavy job for a lower-paid desk position that would keep him closer to home. It was a move made out of love and a practical desire to be a more present husband and father, but it came at a steep cost. The substantial reduction in their household income strained their finances considerably. Furthermore, Keith began to feel trapped and unfulfilled in a job he found dull and unchallenging. He missed the momentum and the sense of accomplishment from his previous role. A quiet frustration took root and began to grow. Meanwhile, Darlene's spending habits reportedly didn't adjust to their new financial reality. She maintained a pristine home that was always ready for guests, hosted gatherings for friends and family, and continued buying things they could no longer reasonably afford. Their arguments, once rare, now frequently and bitterly centered around money. Keith came to believe she was careless and reckless with their finances. He grew increasingly resentful as more and more of the day-to-day childcare responsibilities fell on him and his parents next door. Friends and relatives began noticing a palpable change. The once happy-go-lucky couple now seemed tense and distant. There were quiet complaints whispered to friends, a subtle but growing emotional distance, and a mounting pressure that seemed to hang in the air between them. Still, despite the cracks forming in their marriage, there was no outward indication that either Keith or Darlene wanted a divorce. Keith, in particular, seemed absolutely determined to hold things together for the sake of his sons. But everything changed irrevocably on the morning of November 9, 2005. At exactly 6:11 a.m., a distressed Darlene called emergency services. Her voice trembled as she described a chilling and violent scene. The back door of their home, she said, was wide open. Her husband, Keith, was lying in their bed, covered in blood, and was barely breathing. She told the dispatcher that some of Keith's guns were missing from his gun cabinet and then provided a disturbingly graphic detail. He was gurgling, with a pink foam bubbling from his mouth. Darlene went on to explain that she hadn't slept beside Keith that night. Their youngest son, Cade, just 18 months old at the time, had been restless and fussy. According to her account, she had taken the toddler into a separate bedroom where their other 2 sons were already sleeping and had stayed there to help them all fall back asleep. She said she played a movie for the boys and remained in the room with them until 6 a.m. It was only when she awoke, she claimed, that she discovered the open back door and found her husband gravely wounded. Paramedics arrived at the Gentry residence shortly thereafter. They found Keith still alive, but his life was hanging by the thinnest of threads. He had been shot in the head and was completely unresponsive. The pink foam at his mouth, a clinical sign of severe pulmonary edema often associated with catastrophic head trauma, suggested that he was unlikely to recover. Emergency crews worked frantically to stabilize him and rushed him to Hillcrest Baptist Medical Center in Waco, where he was immediately placed on life support. Despite the heroic efforts of the medical personnel, Keith Gentry never regained consciousness. 2 days later, on November 11, 2005, he was pronounced dead. A homicide investigation was now officially underway. Detectives from the McLennan County Sheriff's Office quickly turned their full attention to the only other adult present in the home that night, Darlene. Her version of events became the central focus of the case, and she was brought in for formal questioning almost immediately. Darlene recounted to police that the evening of November 8th had begun uneventfully. She had gone out for dinner and drinks with friends, returning home at approximately 8:30 p.m. But what she walked into, she said, was not a warm welcome. Keith, according to Darlene, was upset. He had discovered a restaurant receipt, which he viewed as fresh evidence of yet another reckless and irresponsible expenditure. Given their well-documented financial difficulties, it struck a particularly sensitive nerve. The two argued, and Darlene said she left the house in frustration, driving around for a while to cool off. When she returned later that night, she claimed she apologized to Keith and tried to move past the disagreement. Keith then went to bed in the master bedroom, and Darlene, she insisted, stayed with their 3 sons in one of the other rooms. She reiterated that this was to help settle their youngest child, who had been fussy that night. She recalled waking briefly around 5:15 a.m. after hearing the family dog bark, but thinking little of it. Since their dog occasionally barked at nothing, she went back to sleep. Around 6 a.m., she said, she finally got out of bed, walked through the house, and went to wake Keith for work. When he didn't answer her calls, she entered the bedroom and found him lying in bed, unresponsive and bleeding. She also claimed to have noticed at that point that the back door was wide open and that their locked gun cabinet had been tampered with, its contents gone. Darlene's version of events painted a chilling scenario of a random home invasion. Someone had broken into their home during the night, murdered her husband, and stolen a number of firearms, leaving no trace behind. But as the investigation progressed, seasoned detectives began to notice troubling inconsistencies and logical flaws that called her entire narrative into serious question. To begin with, there was the timing. Darlene stated she hadn't checked on Keith until 6 a.m., but forensic analysis of the scene suggested the shooting likely occurred well before that. The trajectory of the bullet, the degree of blood pooling and coagulation, and Keith's medical condition all pointed to a significantly earlier attack, one that would have produced a loud, sharp report that would have been incredibly difficult to sleep through, especially in a relatively small house with 3 young children. More red flags appeared at the crime scene itself. While Darlene had claimed that multiple guns were missing from the cabinet, investigators discovered several of them stacked neatly just outside the back of the house. This was highly inconsistent with the behavior of a typical burglar who would be in a rush to flee a crime scene. In fact, it looked as if someone had carefully placed the weapons there, perhaps in a clumsy attempt to stage a scene. Adding to the suspicion, only 2 people had access to the gun cabinet, Keith and Darlene. Whoever opened it knew where it was located and where the key was hidden. It strained credulity to believe that a random intruder would have such specific knowledge about the home's layout and security arrangements, bypass other valuables, and head straight for the guns. Then there was Darlene's behavior, which struck investigators as profoundly odd for a trained medical professional. As a registered nurse, she had the skills and should have had the presence of mind to administer CPR, apply pressure to the wound, or at the very least check for signs of life. But she did none of these things. When paramedics arrived, she hadn't made any attempts to help Keith, nor had she even left the room she was in to guide them to her dying husband. Instead, she stayed locked in the bedroom with the children, claiming fear for their safety as the reason for her inaction. Investigators also took note of another oddity, the 911 call itself. Rather than the frantic, incoherent panic one might expect from someone who had just found their spouse shot in bed, Darlene's voice, while trembling, was remarkably composed. She spoke clearly, offering a surprisingly detailed and structured timeline of her actions and sleeping arrangements. Her tone came across more like someone trying to carefully explain away suspicion than someone in the throes of a life-altering crisis. Later that same morning, Darlene sat down for a formal interview at the police station. But the moment the questions from detectives became more direct and probing, she hesitated. Without warning, she invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and asked for a lawyer. The interview was immediately stopped. Despite this, Darlene publicly maintained that she had done nothing wrong. In her own words, she claimed she loved her husband and would never do anything to harm him. She spoke about their life together, acknowledging the financial strain and the immense pressure of raising 3 small boys, but insisted that their problems were ordinary, not anything that would lead to such horrific violence. Still, investigators couldn't ignore the gaping holes in her story. The evidence at the scene suggested something far more intimate and far more calculated than a home invasion. As detectives dug deeper, the questions continued to mount. Who had the motive? Who had the access? And who had the opportunity? Though Darlene's voice often cracked with emotion in her public statements, appearing at times tearful, at times confused, her words did little to shift the growing cloud of suspicion away from her. She spoke of Keith's immense love for his boys. She insisted that she loved him too. Still, suspicion wasn't enough. Authorities needed hard, irrefutable evidence. With Darlene's consent, they conducted another thorough search of the Gentry home. There were no signs of forced entry, something they had already expected. But what they did find would prove to be far more damning. Buried deep inside the kitchen trash bin, underneath the day's other garbage, investigators uncovered a pair of latex gloves. Hidden carefully within the fingers of the gloves was a single .22 caliber shell casing, microscopic traces of gunshot residue, and DNA. Forensic analysis of that DNA pointed to just two people, Keith and Darlene. It was a major breakthrough. Then came the discovery of a possible motive. Detectives learned that Keith had a life insurance policy valued at between $500,000 and $750,000. For someone in Darlene's documented financial distress, it was a sum large enough to raise serious questions about her intent. 19 days after the shooting, on November 28, 2005, Darlene Gentry was arrested and charged with the murder of her husband. But her arrest didn't last long. That same day, Keith's parents, Weeman and Glenda Gentry, who had stood loyally and publicly by her side since the tragedy, posted a $50,000 bond to secure her release. The Gentry family, including Keith's own parents, refused to believe that Darlene could be capable of such a heinous crime. They stood by her, unwavering in their support. To them, she was not just Keith's wife, but the mother of their beloved grandchildren, someone they had trusted and loved as a daughter. But then, new and startling information emerged that would test their fate. Not long after her release on bail, Darlene contacted a local landowner and acquaintance, a man named Robert Pavolella. She expressed a sudden interest in purchasing a rural piece of property he owned near Extell, Texas. The land featured a serene pond, and Darlene remarked that it reminded her of Keith's dream to one day take their sons fishing. It was a touching sentiment if it had ended there. But a few weeks later, Darlene called Pavolella again, this time with an unusual and alarming request. She asked if he could fill in the pond. The sudden change of heart was jarring. Just weeks earlier, she had been enthusiastic about the water feature, framing it as a potential tribute to Keith's memory. Now, she wanted it completely gone. Pavolella sensed something was deeply wrong. Troubled by the bizarre request, he trusted his instincts and contacted the authorities. Detectives immediately took a keen interest in the pond. If Darlene wanted it filled in so badly, they reasoned, perhaps it was because it concealed something she desperately didn't want found. A search was quickly organized, and what they discovered at the bottom of the murky water confirmed their instincts. There, resting in the silt, was a .22 caliber revolver, the same caliber as the shell casing found in the latex gloves in her kitchen trash. It was the murder weapon. Yet, despite the overwhelming circumstantial weight of this discovery, investigators still needed a direct, undeniable link between Darlene and the gun in the pond. And so, they turned to Robert Pavolella again, this time asking him to help them set a trap. He agreed to cooperate. Posing as if he were going along with her request, Pavolella called Darlene and told her that he was preparing to fill the pond, but first, he would need to drain it. Police were banking on the possibility that if Darlene knew the pond might be emptied, exposing its contents, she would act fast to remove any incriminating evidence still inside. She took the bait. Over the phone, Darlene remained calm and agreeable. She didn't object. She didn't panic. But the very next day, under the watchful eyes of hidden surveillance cameras meticulously placed by law enforcement, she arrived at the property. Wearing wading boots and carrying a long rod, she stepped into the murky water and began methodically poking and probing at the pond bed, concentrating her search on the very spot where authorities had already retrieved the gun. The entire event was recorded on video. And with that, detectives had exactly what they needed. In February 2007, Darlene Gentry, now 32, stood trial in McLennan County, Texas. The trial lasted 5 intense days. She faced a charge of first-degree murder for shooting her husband while he slept in their Robinson home. The prosecution's case centered on the devastating surveillance video. The footage of Darlene, clad in waders, searching the pond in a desperate attempt to recover the murder weapon days after it had already been seized by police, was the moment that shattered her defense. The latex gloves in the trash, the poorly staged burglary, the conflicting timeline, all of it now pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Her defense team, perhaps seeing the writing on the wall, chose not to call any witnesses during the trial's guilt-innocence phase. They relied instead on cross-examinations and procedural arguments, but the mountain of evidence was simply too strong to overcome. On February 8, 2007, the verdict was delivered: guilty of first-degree murder. Darlene Gentry was sentenced to 60 years in prison. The prosecution successfully argued that her motive was both emotional and financial. She wanted out of her marriage, she wanted a new kind of freedom, and she wanted the financial security that came with Keith's life insurance payout. In their final remarks to the jury, prosecutors warned them against being swayed by appearances or Darlene's carefully crafted persona. Darlene is currently serving her sentence at the Dr. Lane Murray Unit, a female prison in Gatesville, Texas. In November 2017, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied her request for a new trial. Her conviction remains intact. According to official records, she will be eligible for parole in February 2037. If parole is denied, she will serve her full sentence until her release date in February 2067. Darlene Gentry has always maintained her innocence, but the consequences of that dark November morning have reached far beyond the confines of her prison cell. In 2010, a judge granted permanent custody of Chase, Cody, and Kate to Keith's parents, Weeman and Glenda Gentry. A restraining order was also issued, prohibiting Darlene from having any contact whatsoever with her sons. According to court documents, she hasn't spoken to them since. Keith Gentry was a man defined by a quiet but profound strength. He was a devoted father, a loyal husband, and a hard-working provider who ultimately chose family over ambition and stability over status. He left behind 3 young boys who would grow up without him, a grieving family forced to confront an unimaginable betrayal, and a legacy built on integrity and an unconditional love for his children. Though his life was tragically and violently cut short, those who knew and loved Keith remember him not for the brutal way he died, but for the gentle and honorable way he lived. His memory endures in the hearts of his family, his friends, and especially in the lives of the sons he loved more than anything in the world.